Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am joined by writer and mental health advocate Rachel Kelly today. Welcome back, Rachel.
Well, it's lovely to be chatting to you again. Thank you, Tara.
I'm so delighted to have you here and to talk about your new book
Mm-hmm.
that is called You'll Never Walk Alone. I have it here. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it's a compilation of poems that you have. Well, I'll let you explain the book. How about that? How about you explain You'll Never Walk Alone?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you how it came about. It was very linked to my mum's death. So my mum died 4 years ago, January the 12th, just over 4 years ago. And she had always been a big lover of poetry and had really introduced me to it. So it was never something I was scared of. It's always something that I loved and I shared with her. And it had always been an important part of my life, especially when I first suffered severe depression. And I found some poems to sort of help me through. But when my mum died, I sort of went deeper with poetry. And this might sound quite counterintuitive, but one of the gifts of her death was also to really fully feel joy and poems that allowed and enabled joy. So I wanted to put this book together about unlocking feelings. And I think hitherto I'd use poetry more for sort of sadder feelings, but this book has also got poetry that kind of unlocks more joyful feelings. And that was really how it came about. One of my mum's ideas, she said to me when in the last few days before she died, was sort of go deeper. And this is a book about going deeper into feelings, sad feelings, but joyful feelings as well. So that was sort of its rough genesis, how it came about.
And you are, a writer, so words are very potent for you. And
Yeah.
yeah, how do you feel that poetry helps you personally with your emotional well-being?
So I think it helps in lots of different ways. And I think that in a really simple way, it can tell you a different story. So it can change a negative narrative in your head to a more positive narrative. I'll give you an example of that. So when I was really suffering from very serious anxiety-driven depression in my 30s, I was in hospital and I was holding on to my mum with one hand and my dad, that's a Freudian slip, my husband with the other hand. And I was just in such a terrible state and I was suicidal and I was sort of screaming and saying, I want to die, I want to die. And my mum started really softly repeating this line. And it's from Corinthians, which is in the Bible. And the Bible's full of poetry. And it was just such a simple line, but it just went like this. It said, my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And it was that second bit, my strength is made perfect in weakness, which was an idea, but so beautifully expressed. So the idea being paradoxically that this very dark time that was happening to me, that I would emerge stronger. And that kind of concept of sort of strength and weakness being kind of interconnected in this amazing paradoxical way. But part of its potency was not just that it helped me think in a different way, that actually maybe, I didn't want to die because I would come through this and I would come through stronger, but also because of the beauty of the language and the way that message came across. And so I suppose that's sort of partly how poetry works for me, that it does help me rethink. And I'm very drawn to poems that help that dialogue. So a negative, not good enough dialogue and rethinking it, but with this sort of beautiful language. I suppose the second way that I think that poetry really helps me with emotions is that it requires you to sort of, as I say, go deeper, often unpack meaning. So it's sort of very brevity and it's intensity and sort of extraordinary images require you to focus and be present. And we all know that with emotions, that it's really easy to bat them away. You know, all the addictions, the busyness, the alcohol, the drugs, we don't want to feel. And because of the complexity of poetry, it forces us to sort of be present and be there and with that feeling in that moment. So that's a kind of second way that it's so important to me, kind of emotionally. And I suppose the third way is that sense of being in the moment with the poem, that sense of companionship, which is partly why, I call the book You'll Never Walk Alone, because somebody else is there with you in that feeling, that they felt it maybe hundreds of years ago, which in itself is very moving. And they're sharing that with you. I'll give you an example. There's an amazing poem called Love by George Herbert. And in that poem, he talks about his own feelings of not feeling good enough, of sort of shame. And he has this phrase, he says he feels guilty of dust and sin. And then he talks about, let my shame go where it doth deserve. And then in the same poem, there's another voice, a voice of love and compassion and acceptance, and that the person is not just lovable, they are love. And that, I suppose, yes, that sense of companionship in your feeling, again, is a kind of another way where poetry for me just lets me go into those feelings.
And when you say the word, the complexity of poetry, which I personally find, that I am very grateful for your book, because you've laid it out in such a way that you've, got poems, but then you've given your interpretation of it, which is.
Yeah, I think that's so important for me. So I started running poetry workshops in about 2014. So with prisons and mental health charities, so I'm ambassador for SANE and Rethink Mental Illness and the Counselling Foundation. And because for me, poetry wasn't scary, what I immediately realized is that for most people, it's like, this isn't for me. It's like, I didn't much like it at school. I didn't really understand it. I can't really unpack its meaning. And I felt that I did have a kind of gift for explanation. And so this is actually very much a book for people who would think, you know what, I've never thought poetry would be part of my mental health toolkit. It's just not been on my radar. And I've found that poetry is quite sort of off-putting and not something that I would be drawn to. And I really love the workshops and kind of explaining, and then people's sort of mind going, oh, that's it. I get it. I'll give you an example. So I've got a couple of haikus in the book, which I like because one of the ways I think poetry can help people with their emotions, another way, is just repetition and using them like mantras. And so we don't want to get stressed with a poem that's so long, we're worried we can't remember it. But a haiku is really short. But there's a lovely one in the book. It's called it's by Basho, who's a 7th century, actually, I think, Japanese writer. And it's called The Temple Bell. And it's very simple. It just goes like this. It says, the temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers. So the temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers. Now that's immediately confusing because sound doesn't come out of flowers. But in my kind of explanation of that poem, I explain how haikus work, which is they yoke together two images in a way that you wouldn't link them. So you wouldn't normally link the temple bell stopping, which kind of evokes a certain image, with this other extraordinary idea of the sound coming out of flowers, and putting those two together. And for me, when I read that, it just jumped at me about my mother's death, because it was like her temple bell had stopped, but in a very extraordinary kind of spiritual connection of all the senses, the sound, the sight, the beauty, the feeling, in all my different ways of kind of remembering her. That sound kept coming out of the flowers. She was in my head. She was with me. In fact, I'm feeling it really energetically now. it's so sensual, it's so beautiful, and it's such an extraordinary image. So yeah, I suppose I do like explaining things and just sharing how I read them. And it may, other people may read them differently, but just basically not to be so scared of them and think, what, poetry, I don't get it.
What do you think your mum would think about You'll Never Walk Alone?
Wow. It's I feel quite emotional. I mean, the thing was, she's much cleverer than me. And she didn't really believe in explaining poetry. She just got it really easily. And she had other gifts. But I feel that I did have this gift of communicating and sharing. And in some ways, and this is maybe going to sound really odd, one of the gifts that she gave to me in her death was that she allowed me to kind of express this thing that I love to do, which is to share and explain. So I feel she's kind of smiling down from heaven and she's thinking, good on you. I'm not in your way. You're fulfilling your gifts and you're doing something and sharing. And I'm different to her. But, we shared something. We both love poetry, but how we then chose to be with it. And so, yeah, I'm really feeling her spirit. I feel she's hovering. I feel she's maybe listening in, and yeah, she's smiling. She's smiling because I think she'd like the idea that maybe more people would find that there was something in poetry for them. And I suppose that's back to the workshops. That's why I felt so passionate about trying to write this book, because I just wanted to share it more broadly, not just in the groups that I ran. And I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a wonderful poem in the book. It's by Derek Walcott. It's called Love After Love. And it's about, why do we find it so hard to love ourselves? Why do we find it so hard to find that self-acceptance and a kind of compassionate inner voice, and the idea that our main relationships with ourselves. And it's about someone looking in the mirror. And for the first time, they look in the mirror and they accept that person and allow that person to be. And it's really interesting, if anybody wants to try saying the poem aloud while you look in the mirror. And it starts off and it says, the time will come when with elation, you will greet yourself in your own mirror. And it's extraordinary because it's got such confidence that all of us will find that moment. We can all find that bit of ourselves that's within us. And we may have told ourselves different stories our whole lives, that we're not good enough and we don't deserve to be loved, or we're not lovable. But that this poem gives you that kind of incredible belief. You will find that ability to become a friend to yourself, really. Anyway, we read it in one of the groups, and this woman read it aloud, because it's, for me, really important that people voice the poem. And in fact, a lot of the poetry therapy research is partly about why saying the words aloud, and they're obviously designed to be said aloud. Anyway, this woman read it, and we were just all spellbound, and people started just couldn't, just all sat absolutely rapt. And she started crying. And then she just said, you know what? I really feel understood. I feel understood for the first time in my life, how hard it is to feel lovable, but also that I can find that connection with myself. And she'd been in and out of psychiatric wards and mental health hospitals and very much going down the medication route. And I'm not saying any of that, may be right for people. But this was working at a very spiritual, very deep level. And, she'd got it there. It was always going to be available to her. So, yeah, I think I've gone off on a tangent. I can't remember what your question was, but...
Well, I was thinking, while you were speaking, especially about your mum and really feeling her, and when you were talking about her, I was getting a lot of those sort of truth chills, as they're sometimes called, going through my body. And I was also having those when you're explaining the moment when your mom and your husband were there holding your hands, and the words, there is great strength in weakness.
Yes, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Yes.
And what I was thinking about was that how, yeah, with the poetry, not all of which that I totally understand, but there are some lines just like that where you get that same sort of chills feeling.
Yes. Well, you're so right. I think it's someone really famous like T.S. Eliot said you could tell if it was good poem because you'd get like the hairs on the back of your neck would stand up. And I mean, I sometimes get goosebumps. And you're also so right. It could just be one line. And in fact, a lot of people who are using it therapeutically and to sort of guide them through difficult times and grief is they often use a sort of mantra. They pull out one line. There's a wonderful one, Desiderata, which is I close the collection with.
Oh, that one. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
And it's just got this wonderful thing about you are a child of the universe. You deserve to be here. And, sometimes I'm awake at night and, and that feeling of being a child of the universe. My mom's gone, but I'm a child of the universe. She was a child of the universe. But we all have a right to be here. So individual lines can suddenly just jump at you. There's another one actually about the eyes that have never cried are the saddest eyes of all, about the rainbow. So a rainbow comes because of the combination of the rain and the sun. But so, i.e., without the sadness, we don't go to those depths of joy. And it's an extraordinary image. And yeah, it's just that line, the eyes that never cried are the saddest eyes of all.
It's almost as if there's that consciousness that is through the words that
yeah
us.
I think it's working. I mean, there have been some studies because I did look at all the clinical studies because I knew that anecdotally it meant such a lot to people in the groups, and then it meant a lot to me personally. But there's actually quite a lot of work now about reading poetry, how it affects one, writing poetry, how it affects one, indeed sharing a poem. So quite a few of the poems in the book were given to me by my mother. So that's that feeling of connection that someone's given you a poem and you feel that link to them. So, but that sense that it's working on a very deep level, there's a view that it does work at a very sort of subconscious almost level of the brain. And it's what we knew through evolution. We sat around the campfire, we shared stories. So it's very recent that things were, written and right in our history. So it's working at a very deep level of the brain. And especially, I think your point about repetition and mantras, just slowly repeating something, again, is working at a very deep level.
And there is something comforting about that idea of, since people were sharing them around campfires or in the 7th century BC, that we are essentially all sort of struggling with the same difficulties a lot of the time. And that's just reiterating that is part of our human experience. And we don't want to embrace that a lot of the time.
I think you've put it beautifully. And I think obviously every generation is facing different challenges and we're in a digital age, but that feeling of our common humanity is profoundly reassuring. And that these are issues that people have been grappling with through the centuries. And that feeling of companionship back through time is quite extraordinary, that there was a person maybe, hundreds and hundreds of years ago who was feeling the same thing. I find that amazing. And in a way, on a really deep level, it makes us feel part of something so much bigger, a kind of cosmos of we're just here briefly, and I profoundly believe in other lives, and we're here for whatever reason. We all have to learn, but I do believe we'll come again, and I love that. I'm feeling it again. I've become very interested in this somatic work. Yeah, but I feel it going back through the centuries, going forward through the centuries, and a profound attempt to express what it is to feel and what it is to be human. And in such beautiful language with these amazing images. And there's one, I've got two poems by Gerard Manley Hopkins, who's a wonderful religious writer. And he has this image of real terrible grief about the mind having mountains down which we can fall. And I remember that feeling of the severe grief at my mother's death, of this sort of tumbling down this mountain. But when I came across that image, there was something comforting that someone else had been there, and they'd felt this tumbling. And I remember sort of holding on tight to things, feeling very wobbly. But there was that companionship that somebody else had felt that, and found an image, and they'd shared that image. And I suppose that's the way I think about poets, is that rather than thinking them, oh, it's scary, I don't understand, it's like they're trying so hard, with images and alliteration and all the things that seem scary, like metaphors and rhythm and rhyme, but they're just ways to sort of deepen that sense of communication. That's how I see them. And that's what I've tried to explain in the book. Don't be put off by this stuff. They're just trying to reach out and hold your hand.
Well, that really brings us back to this title, of You'll Never Walk Alone, and how fitting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I suppose, that poem, that song, it's a song, actually. It's from Carousel, You'll Never Walk Alone. It's been used in lots of ways, Liverpool anthem as well. But for me, what's so special about that is it's got a central metaphor, which is a storm. So it's going on through the wind and the rain and keeping going through this, difficult time, obviously grief and whatever. But the key point about a storm is it ends. And that's what's so brilliantly encapsulated. It's such a simple thing to hold on to. And I think apparently it was it was the single most popular poem song through COVID, and it was across wards in the NHS. Was that sense of we'll keep going, and that we're going through this with others. We're not on our own. So yeah, it's very powerful, even though it's based on a very simple concept, really, that storms do end.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also really enjoyed what you shared about poems being a gift for people. And I'd never personally really thought of that, but I always read a poem at the end of my yoga classes, for example. And
lovely.
A lot of the time people will ask, can you share that? Or if I remember, I will put it on my WhatsApp group. And it is a kind of profound gift to share.
My mum shared with me one particular poem. I might read it out because I don't quite know it by heart, but it was a few months before she died, but I've always had to work at not being a worrier. I naturally default to all those things like rumination and catastrophizing, and even though I know lots of ways to try and address them, but she sent me this poem, which is actually an Inuit prayer called Life's a Journey. And at the time, I couldn't quite work out particularly why she'd shared it. And I had to think what it really meant. But basically for me, it's a poem. She was sending me a message that, I needn't worry. And it's an extraordinary poem. It goes like this: life's a journey, and I think over again my small adventures, when with a shore wind I drifted out in my kayak, and I thought I was in danger. my fears, those small ones that I thought so big, for all the vital things I had to get and to reach. And yet there is only one great thing, the only thing, to live, to see in huts and journeys, the great day that dawns and the light that fills the world. And I might just share a few things I wrote about it, because it's quite, in some, you know, you might be thinking, well, what's this about huts and journeys, and what's that really saying? So it's expressed through the kind of iconography of the Inuit. So their concerns, you know, kayaks, their huts, their journeys. But its message is universal, that actually, you know, we can have confidence in this lovely ending, that the great day that dawns and the light that fills the world. And if we can sort of shift our focus to that kind of trusting the universe in a very profound way. So I started off my explanation by saying how easy it is to misjudge what is important, this poem seems to be saying. We live in a state of fear and danger, pursuing what we imagine to be, in the words of the poem, vital things. But we need not be so frantic. We need not do anything. Instead, we can continue to live our ordinary, ongoing lives with our huts and journeys, but we're free to choose a different perspective. We can appreciate the gift that dawn brings every morning, that the world fills with light, something we're part of without even trying. Anyway, I wrote a bit more about it, but yeah, that was a really extraordinary way of my mother sharing something which was a gift. Mm-hmm. And every time I'm kind of getting wound up about this or that, or the parking ticket, I just, you know, I just hear my mother's voice, you know, the great day that dawns, and just to have that perspective. And Tara, come on, we know each other a bit. I think I'm getting more and more zen.
Yeah, I think so too. It was just making me think about your Instagram post the other day that we were talking about death, and you'd obviously recently had a friend that died, and how what you just shared about death sort of being the great sort of equalizer, in terms of, you know, we get so worried about the parking ticket or the reply to the text message, or, you know, and then it's just like, gosh, you know, really all that matters is the day ahead of us, because we don't know how many more of those we have.
Yeah. I mean, there's that Bhutanese idea from, you know, we should think of death 5 times a day. The really happy person thinks of death 5 times a day. And I think what I felt at the wakes of both those funerals was this sort of extraordinary connection with the people who were there, and just feeling how precious they were, and wanting to share that. And I suppose in the end, what do we really want? We want connection. Mm. What do we really want from, you know, in a way, it's the simplest idea, but when you're deciding if you do want to meet somebody, do something, do you feel connected? Do you want to connect with them? And yeah, so I suppose that's, you know, and it does circle back to poetry in a way, because for me, poetry is another way of connecting. It's a way of connecting with yourself, allowing those feelings, as, you know, when we were starting our chat, but then connecting with others and feeling that connection and sharing it, and indeed connecting with those who have gone. You know, my mother she's sort of on every page in a way.
Absolutely. And like you say, if you feel her presence today.
Yeah, I do. She there's one other one that she gave me again, which I've only really sort of fully appreciated. It's called Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, So Far From Home. And it's about a feeling of abandonment. It was actually a spiritual that enslaved people used to sing in the fields, because, you know, their families were split up, and children were split up from parents. So it's a very dark, you know, feeling like a motherless child so far from home. But what's interesting about it is that I've also been I've had to do a lot of work on not feeling overly responsible as a mother, because I have 5 children, and they've all had lots of dramas, of course, everybody does. But if I was to only be as happy as my happiest child, I would never be happy. And that poem, I feel like A Motherless Child, does have a kind of reconciliation, because there's a limit to a mother's responsibility. And, that's in a very dark context. But again, I was interested. My mother gave it to me, and I think she saw me as a very sometimes overly responsible, overly worrying about my children. And there was something about, a kind of acceptance that we can't control everything, even very sad things that can happen to our children. So yeah, that was another big kind of link with her. And but anyway, there are lots of jolly poems in the book too. I don't want to just make it out to be sad, because she was a big believer in lining up with joy as well.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And you're just such a joyful person to listen to.
Thank you. Well, I think that's she would want us to be, and I do feel that very profoundly, that those that have gone, they want us to fully inhabit our joy.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Well,
yeah.
Beautiful place to complete on. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tara. Yeah, I think that's a big theme for me, that all these feelings are valid. And actually, I did arrange the book on, spring, summer, autumn, winter, wintry, dark feelings, but joyful spring, hopeful ones. And yeah, let's end with that those are important too. And yeah, wishing you joy.
Yes, and once this is ready for people to watch, we will be approaching spring, which is exciting. So
yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Tara. It's been wonderful to chat as ever. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you to everybody who's been listening. And we'll have links to Rachel's work and her book. And please have a look at her writing, which is wonderful. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Tara.